Now, my next guest is the journalist at The Economist and best-selling author Helen Joyce. In July, Helen's book, Trans When Ideology Meets Reality, was published to great acclaim. And Helen Joyce joins me now. Hi, Helen. Thanks for joining me on Free Speech Nation.
Hi, Andrew. Thanks for having me on.
Now, we've obviously spoken before on my podcast, but a lot has happened since then. And I wanted to talk to you specifically about what happened this week. The BBC published an article which talked about testimonies from various women, predominantly lesbians, who talked about the way in which they were feeling pressurised into accepting trans people into their dating pool and were being called transphobic if they didn't accept it. A lot of people are going to be confused about this because there was a massive backlash. People are very, very angry about this article. Perhaps you might be able to explain to us why this is causing such a stir.
Well, if you think about it from the point of view of the trans activists, obviously lesbians should be considering trans women as members of their dating pool because, as we're told, trans women are women. So if you're a gay woman, you should be looking at women as your dating pool, and trans women are women. But then you learn the second bit of the equation, which is that trans just means a declaration. So a trans woman could be you if you say, I'm a woman. So suddenly you're a member of a lesbian's dating pool. Now, of course, most actual trans women don't go around the place saying, you've got to go to bed with me or else. But the ideology is that a lesbian must regard male people as members of her dating pool if those male people declare themselves to be women.
So the question is really one of gender self-identification. That's the issue that a lot of people have. Am I right?
Yeah, that's right. So I call it gender identity ideology, the idea that what makes you a man or a woman is what you say you are, what you feel you are and what you say you are, rather than what you were conceived, male or female. And within that ideology, lesbians are female-identified people or woman-identified people who find woman-identified people sexually attractive. They could both be male, in fact. It's just divorced from biology entirely.
But of course, a lot of people would say, well, look, we live in a society where there are transphobic people. There are people who feel hate and animosity towards people. So in a sense, when we talk about gender identity ideology and we'd say we don't agree with it, are we not fueling that? Are we not fueling transphobia? That would be the argument.
It's this word transphobia, isn't it? What does it mean? I mean, most people who are not close to this debate think it must mean that you're horrible to people, that you're shouting at people on the street, that you calling people nasty names. Actually, what the activists mean is just that you think biology is real and can't necessarily be overridden by a declaration. So if you're a woman who says, I respect trans people, I fully respect everybody's right to identify how they want. The fact is, my sexuality is directed solely towards male people or solely towards female people, that's transphobic to them.
And that doesn't really make sense because so much of gay rights has been about the acknowledgement of the biological reality, that people are attracted to their own sex. And more we see this as being redefined as same gender attracted, and that's not what it means. Can you explain to the viewers what is exactly meant by gender identity ideology? It's a complicated question, but can you just sort of give us a précis of that?
I mean, I've written an entire book about it and it's hard for me to explain it just because I think it's so ridiculous. But it's really, really simple. It's this idea that, I am a woman if I say I'm a woman. And I mean, that makes no sense because then what's a woman? Like straight away it's circular. There's no actual sort of bottom to it, no definition of it. But so what's happened here is that really this ideology has grown without people thinking about it, thinking their thought the whole way through to the end, basically. Yeah. So people think, well, I don't want to be mean, and these are people who are suffering, and, what's the harm in calling a male person she if that's what that person wants? And, it doesn't matter what people wear, and I agree with all of that. And then at some point, the rubber hits the road at the moment at which you think, well, if you're a heterosexual woman, which people does that mean that you're willing to sleep with? Or if you're a homosexual woman or whatever. Or, it comes in women's sports, or it comes when you decide who is going to be allowed into, which changing rooms or showers or whatever. Because there are these places where you can't fudge it anymore. You can't just say, what's the harm? And so this article was about one of the places that's kind of been ignored by mainstream society for the past few years. We've got these two minority groups, trans people and lesbians. And the trans people more and more are represented by activists who I, by the way, don't think a lot of the trans people agree with. But the activists say you're transphobic unless you say a woman is anyone who identifies as a woman. Lesbians know damn well that the fact is they're women who find women attractive, meaning female people. And those two things can't meet. They can't be made to match up with each other. And so that article was a moment, a very good piece of journalism, was a moment when this broke out into the open. And the responses were very revealing, because a lot of activists were, you're only talking about a few people, you're tarring all trans people with the same brush, you're saying that trans women are all rapists, and so on. And then there was this amazing quote in the article from Nancy Kelly, who's the boss of Stonewall, which is now just a trans activist organisation, saying that actually, yes, it is transphobic for a lesbian not to consider trans women as potential dating partners. And she made this extraordinary analogy with, black women or fat women or older women or anything like this. So to be a male person for her is the same as being black or fat. And that completely destroys the whole basis, as you say, of the idea of sexual orientation. It's like conversion therapy, frankly.
I mean, that was quite shocking, because she was effectively saying that if you don't consider certain people in your dating pool, you're the equivalent of a racist. And as Kathleen Stock pointed out, that is incredible pressure. If we're talking about people being pressurised, I mean, that's surely a good example of that, isn't it?
Exactly. So the article went, like the responses went, you're saying that trans people pressurise people into having sex with them even when they're the wrong sex. And that's a total lie. You're a transphobe for saying it. And by the way, anyone who doesn't have sex with, or isn't willing to have sex with someone of the wrong sex, is a bigot. Like it was literally proving the point that the article was trying to make.
Yes. But also there was this added problem that, here we have an article, a very wide-ranging article, with many, many women's testimonies. I think it was up to 80 different people. And all of a sudden, activists are saying they're lying. This isn't real. And I thought we'd got to the point where we were saying we should believe people's, particularly their lived experience, which is something these activists always go on about, isn't it?
Yeah, believe all women except, these ones. Believe all women except the transphobics, basically. I mean, one of the things that was extraordinary about it is it quoted a study, just a self-selected study of people that she reached out to by a particular lesbian woman, a woman called Angela Wilde. And she asked about 80 people. And it was absolutely not a representative sample. It's what's called a convenience sample, which is a very common way to do an early piece of research, by the way. This is standard in sociology. And she reached out to them via friends and, partly on social media, but partly through her own networks. And she asked these 80 women, all of them lesbians, had they had any experience of being pressured to have sex with or consider dating male people who identified as women. And more than half of them said yes. And then suddenly all these people who are willing to quote these terrible, terrible studies by people like Stonewall, like, 20 people saying that, they considered suicide and suddenly we now, are changing the laws to do with, how children are transitioned or something. All these people suddenly become all concerned about data quality. It wasn't meant to be a representative sample. It was just a preliminary study saying, look, there's this thing happening. This is a real phenomenon. This is actually happening to some women. Let's look into this.
Well, certainly, when someone comes to you and says they've had this experience, it should be taken seriously, surely. And I think another thing that people are very confused about with this entire story is that where has this come from, this idea that biological sex isn't real? Because most trans people believe that it is. And I remember Blair White made this point, that if there's no such thing as biological sex, there's no such thing as trans. Blair White is a trans writer. This isn't fair, is it, to say that the more extreme activists and their obsession with gender identity, what you describe as a kind of sexed soul in your book, that's not representative of trans people, is it? It's just representative of activists.
Yeah, I think it's an ideology that's taken hold of a lot of people who aren't anything to do with transness. They don't identify as trans themselves for a wide range of reasons. Like, one thing is it's just fashion. It's particularly fashion on campuses. But it's also because it's seen as the next sort of civil rights movement. So it's just seen as a thing to go on to because it's fun. But also it's where you go if you're a misogynist. Like, I'm absolutely not saying that all trans activists are misogynists. What I'm saying is that if you are a misogynist, this is a great place to be. Because this is where you can go and you can basically say anything you like about women. I mean, I won't repeat the ruder things that were said to various of the lesbian women here, but suck this, that, and the other. And but yeah, you can say these things without any comeback. And in fact, you're a social justice warrior for saying them.
It has been interesting because I saw a tweet a couple of years ago where someone a trans activist was making this point that if lesbians don't want to sleep with me, then they're evil, transphobic bigots. And I just dismissed it at the time. And then people have now been collecting these screenshots of these tweets, and there are thousands and thousands and thousands of these tweets, often very violent, often involving rape threats and all sorts of threats of violence. It's a very real thing, and it's not trans people. It's this minority of extreme activists. And do you think that this is in any way helping the trans cause?
I think it's the worst possible thing for the trans cause. Like if you're a person who's very unhappy with your sexed body and you've decided to, to some extent, possibly a large extent, go through medical or surgical procedures to make yourself feel more comfortable, what you want more than anything else is to be left alone and accepted as a human being, an unusual human being who, needs accommodations and understanding. You absolutely don't need people saying deranged things, like sex isn't real, or, that sexual orientation is directed at a feeling in someone else's head, or that your rights as a trans woman override everybody else's rights to see and name and recognize reality, in front of their eyes. And that's the worst possible thing. This is what leads to massive backlash. But again, it's the ideology that does this. If you say trans women are women, this is where you get to. It's just a logical deduction. If trans women are women, then lesbians must regard them as part of their dating pool. That's a theorem. You have to go back and say, well, trans women aren't women. Trans women are trans women.
And we're not able to have this conversation, really, because the level of toxicity around the debate, as we saw in the Kathleen Stock case recently, and people saw for themselves just how sort of extreme this has become. And, of course, feminists, and a lot of gender-critical feminists in particular, have a genuine concern about women's only domestic violence, refuge spaces or changing spaces or things like that. Do you think that we can reach a point? Because I've tried to invite people from all sides onto this programme. It's so difficult to achieve. But do you think we will reach a point where we can have these conversations, where the temperature will be lowered, so to speak?
No, I think we just have to win, that's all. I think the only way that we can actually, get male people out of women's prisons and women's domestic shelters and so on is to actually win against them. Because there's just this hard core of people who've basically adopted a weird sort of postmodernist neo-religion and seem to be willing to break everything, the world, their own movement, the lives of trans people, the lives of women, children, everything in this cause. We've seen this before. People can be quite fanatical. So no, we've actually just got to win. We've got to talk around these people and talk to politicians, talk to policymakers, talk to people who are running companies, universities. Sussex University let Kathleen Stock down very, very badly. She's been bullied for the past 3 years. If your listeners don't know, she's a philosophy professor who had to leave this week, who resigned her post at Sussex University after 3 years of bullying. And if Sussex had stood up 3 years ago, this wouldn't have happened. So I don't think we can waste our time trying to debate people who believe crazy, deranged things and whose response to just stating women's rights and biological reality is to make rape and death threats. We have to talk around them to the policymakers and actually just sideline them and, just reinforce the British law, which is very good and which states that sex is sex, it is male and female. Really, we can have sex-segregated spaces. Really, we do not have to have lesbians being bullied like this. Sexual orientation is a protected characteristic. And just, ignore the extremists.
Welcome to the GB News YouTube channel. You can watch us live 24 hours a day, catch up on your favourite shows, and join in the conversation in the comments below.
Don't forget to subscribe and you'll never miss any of our exclusive content.